This idea of a twin seems to have haunted him from the start. I read somewhere that he agonised over the possibility that he might have taken too much of his mother's milk, and that's why the twin died. Maybe it's a speculation too far, but do you think this idea of the dead twin hovering through his life contributed to his split sense of what a person is?
I think it's absolutely central. I think there was a point in his life much later on where he explored this in some of his work, where he suddenly felt that the possibility that it was he who had died and that it was his twin sister who had lived, and that his whole life was what it is to be dead, in fact. And that reversal, that flip of context, the ability to suddenly completely shift the paradigm that you find yourself in, is indicative of Dick's work. But that twinning, that doubling, again, Shakespeare had twins, one of them died, and Hamlet is potentially a result of that. And I think clearly this was something that was right at the heart of what was going on for Dick. The idea that there is a separate self that is both the same as you, it is you, but it is also separate from you. It's having an existence somewhere else that you can't see. You don't know whether you were, the guilt that comes with that he lived with throughout his life. The fact that I believe this is true, that his gravestone was there waiting for him. His twins, as Roger said, he was buried next to his twin, but the gravestone was there waiting just with the date left to be put on. So throughout his life, that was waiting for him, his death.
And the other really extraordinary link to Hamlet is that his mother married his uncle, and his stepfather had twins. So he got step twins, which kind of replaced him in a curious way. So when you see him in his work looking at people who literally split in half, or the hemispheres of their brain split in half, and they no longer know each other, it's all back down to that kind of original story, traumatic story in his childhood.
Dreadful relationship with his mother. He must have liked women because he married 5, but it didn't seem to work out. Was there a problem about women? His women characters don't particularly spring to life, do they?
Oh, well, I think for him, the woman is an existential problem for the narrator to solve. So in some ways, it's like
what do you mean?
Well, the woman is a difficulty, a space that he's trying to work through the questions of male identity, which are really at the centre of his fiction. So you're right in the sense that he's not very interested in women characters. On the other hand, he read very deeply into the work of Carl Jung and had this very sophisticated sense that what he was searching for was a kind of anima figure, as Jung would call it, the feminine principle. It's just that he couldn't quite find his Platonic ideal without moving through quite a lot of examples of it, as it were.
You're listening to Great Lives on Radio 4, where my guests today are the actor Michael Sheen, who's exploring the life of Philip.K. Dick with the help of Roger Luckhurst. Michael, do you have a favourite Philip.K. Dick novel?
Well, in some ways the first one I ever read, because that had such a huge impact. I'd never read anything like it before, really. And even as I was reading it, and when I finished reading it, I still couldn't be quite sure that I'd read what I'd read. And
that was it that you've got with you
It was
there?
Flow My Tears, the Policeman Said, which is also just one of the greatest titles I've ever come across.
I see you've got a little pile of his books there. Is there anything from any of them that you could read now that you would think especially indicative?
One of the things that I think is very indicative of Dick's writing for me is the moment where the central character begins to discover that maybe the reality that he is living in and that he is taken for granted may not be everything that's going on, and that maybe there's something else going on behind it. And that is a very, very frightening moment. And that happens again and again in his stories. But I'm going to read just a little bit from Flow My Tears, the Policeman Said, which is about a character who is very famous. He sort of discovers overnight that he's no longer the person with the life that he had, and suddenly everything has shifted around him. And this just gives a little sense of maybe that shift and that paranoia. All his identification cards were gone. Cards that made it possible for him to stay alive. Cards that got him through Paul and Nat barricades without being shot or thrown into a forced labour camp. I can't live 2 hours without my ID, he said to himself. I don't even dare walk out of the lobby of this rundown hotel and onto the public sidewalk. They'll assume I'm a student or teacher escaped from one of the campuses. I'll spend the rest of my life as a slave, doing heavy manual labor. I am what they call an unperson.
Novels like Flow My Tears, the policeman said, were written against the idea of Big Brother and against the backdrop of the incoming Nixon administration. It reflected a certain suspicion of the state. Your production of The Passion touched on exactly those themes. Was that deliberate or coincidental?
It was both deliberate and coincidental. In a way, Philip.K. Dick was sort of like had sort of antenna and absorbed what was going on around him socially and culturally, but also what was going on around him socially and culturally seemed to be reflected by his own mental state. So there is the intense paranoia of that period of time, surveillance, with the whole Watergate scandal. But there is also what was going on for Philip.K. Dick in his own personal life, that he was intensely paranoid about everything that was going on around him. And the dividing line between what we might consider mental illness in him seemed to be in total harmony with the socio-political, cultural period that he was living in. So it's very difficult to divide the two. But there's something that happened in his life towards the end of his life where things really started to get very, very freaky. I mean, they were freaky throughout his life, but it got very freaky towards the end. And he was living on painkillers. He didn't want to leave his house, so the painkillers had to be delivered to him. And the woman who came from the drugstore to deliver them, when he came to the door, she was wearing a sort of a locket or a necklace of some kind. And the sun reflected off this locket and dazzled him in the eyes. And he believed afterwards that some blinding revelation came to him. And one of the things that came to him in that blinding revelation was that he was still living in the period after Jesus Christ, during the Roman Empire still, and that he was part of a sort of resistance movement, and that this memory had laid dormant in him to be activated by what happened with this woman. And in that moment I suddenly thought, this is an extraordinary coincidence that this should be happening, that I'm about to go and do a piece of work about that period of time whilst also working on Hamlet and all these different concepts that Dick had.
Tell us a little more, Roger, about these visions.
Well, what's really amazing about that experience is that he was no longer on hallucinogenic drugs. I mean, in the 60s, he was up to 1,000 amphetamines a month. He used to take them in handfuls from a jar and eat them with yoghurt to line his stomach so that they wouldn't upset him too much. He came off those in 1970, his brain completely fried. Wrote a brilliant novel about that called A Scanner Darkly. And it was after that he was clean of drugs. He had this extraordinary vision, which he partly took to be a religious vision, as Michael was saying, a sense of being able to see first century AD Middle East landscapes around him in California, and then also getting these beams of light coming from what he called not God but Valis, vast active living intelligence system, which would beam him information in really compressed ways, and he had to unpack the information, which he did for 8 years every night. 2.5 million words of what he called his exegesis.
And is it gobbledygook? Does it make any sense?
It's a really fascinating snapshot of the time. I mean, just to what Michael was saying about him getting rid of his filters is exactly right. He was courageous enough to do that and foolhardy enough to do that because it was an insane time. I mean, Joan Didion's portrait of California in the 60s in the White Album is Philip Dick's world. These mad, insane Manson murders, the kind of crazy things that the Doors were doing, the hippies, the counterculture, the paranoia, the fact that there were FBI agents trying to track down right-wing groups, left-wing groups. He lived very close to Angela Davis, the black revolutionary, and so on. So he was fully in that ferment, and it totally fried his brain, I think, in a way that's quite extraordinary, and we benefit from, I think, as a snapshot of a time.
He was living a chaotic life. I mean, his life was in a mess.
He could not organise himself financially or in terms of...
And there were drugs, and there were marriages.
Every time a marriage failed, he really did fall through the floor. And in early 1970s, he opened his house to anyone who would like to come. So it was a drug den. It was full of weird, strange, threatening types. He was actually broken into in 1971 in a rather famous incident. And there are tapes that have been published of him theorising about who might have done that. And it's actually very funny because there are so many interpretations that are swirling around. It was the right wing, it was the left wing, it was the black radicals.